Welcome. Let's talk about the new highlight pseudo elements. I'm Delan. When I was 8 years old, I found a book on my parents' shelf about this strange little thing called DHTML, and I've been in love with the web ever since. Over a decade later, I wanted to find out whether the change event or the click event comes first on a drop-down box. So I went straight to the spec, and that's how I got into building the web as a platform. And then I joined Igalia in December of last year to do more of the same. Shoutouts to my colleague Rego, who has helped a great deal with this project as well. So I'll start off with an overview of how the highlight pseudos should work according to the spec. Then I'll go into where we're at with Chromium's implementation. And finally, we'll take a look at the remaining work to be done. Now, our work at Igalia is primarily funded by customers needing things done in open source code bases. In this case, Bloomberg has an internal version of Chromium which they've modified to allow you to change the colors of the squiggly lines under spelling and grammar errors. They asked us for help with upstreaming the patch, but it's one thing to modify some software to suit your specific needs. Turning that into something that's suitable for adoption by the general public, that interacts well with other features and can be specified and tested in a cohesive way that makes sense to other implementers. That was a lot more involved than I anticipated. The highlight pseudos are mostly defined in the CSS pseudo spec. Throughout the spec, a lot of the pseudos are defined in relation to some other real element in the tree. These elements are known as originating elements, and I'm going to mention that a lot in this talk. Among those, there are 4 built-in highlight pseudos and 1 more flexible kind of highlight with an author-defined key. These highlights, as well as each of the custom highlights, can have independent styles. Selection is quite special in that it was widely implemented and shipped before it was formalized in any specs. With target text, there's a new kind of fragment URL where you can have a link that jumps to and highlights a specific passage of text, and target text allows you to style that highlight. And with spelling error and grammar error, you can essentially style the squiggly lines that indicate where you might have misspelled or otherwise made a mistake in your input. The highlight pseudos are unique in pretty much every way: how they're defined conceptually, how their styles are computed, and how they are painted. On the one hand, most pseudos interact with the box tree in some way. You've got your tree-abiding pseudos like before and after. Those generate a box that's an immediate child of the originating element. Similarly, for your typographic pseudos like first line and first letter, those generate inline boxes, and sometimes they even split boxes. But unlike those, highlights don't interact with the box tree. They are actually singletons, so in any given document, there is only 1 selection pseudo, there's 1 target text pseudo, and so on. This has some implications for things like translucent backgrounds and text decorations. Despite that, they are present at every location in the tree. It's just that their styles can vary depending on where we are in the tree. One of the biggest changes under the new highlight model is that styles are inherited through each highlight tree. In this example, we have a rule saying that selections under the aside element should have a yellow background. We also have a B element here, or bold, and highlight inheritance means that that should be yellow as well. This is more or less what Opera did under the Presto engine, but the other engines currently inherit selection styles from the originating element only. What this means is that essentially with this word brown here, the yellow selection background would be reset to the browser's default highlight color, which is this blue over here. In this example, we have the words quick brown fox, where quick is misspelled. We've clicked a link that jumps to the word brown, and finally the letters K, C, B, and R are selected. Highlights are painted in layers on top of the originating content, with one overlay per highlight pseudo. We alternate between the backgrounds and the text while painting all of the overlays, but any given piece of text is only painted once by the topmost highlight that applies to that piece of text. So for this example, we start off with the originating content. We'll paint Fox because that is the only text that is not highlighted by anything. Next up, if we had any custom highlights, they would go here, followed by the same for grammar errors. Next, we have the spelling errors. Now, quick is misspelled, but we'll only paint the Q, U, and I because the K and C are also highlighted by selection, which we haven't gotten to yet. Then for the target text, we start off by painting the background color, followed by the text own in brown, again because the B and R are also highlighted by selection. Finally, we paint the same for the selection highlight, so the background color followed by the highlighted text. We only want to paint each piece of text once to avoid issues with things like anti-aliasing and performance, but we need to lift the text into that topmost layer as well as its decorations. This is important because if we didn't, we might end up with situations where the background color for one highlight might obscure the text in a lower highlight, which, if the background color was opaque, could make the text entirely unreadable. In the past, most implementations of selection only allowed you to change aspects of how the originating content was styled. How it's been spec'd is quite different. Here, the target text and selection highlights have added their own text shadows that are completely independent of that first one. In fact, under this new model, it's actually not possible for highlight pseudos to change or remove things like shadows and text decorations other than their own. Text shadows fit into the highlight painting order like this. Again, we start with the originating content. We paint its text shadows in full, no matter what's highlighted. Then we paint the text proper, skipping over the highlighted parts. For target text, we paint the background color, followed by the shadows of just the highlighted part, followed by the text proper. Again, B and R are also being highlighted by selection, so we'll skip those for now. Then for selection, we have the background color, the shadow, and then the text proper. So that's how the highlights are supposed to work. Where we're at currently is we've got spelling and grammar error under the CSS spelling grammar errors blink feature. These are now supported in style, just like any other highlight. However, being supported in style doesn't actually mean too much. It only really means that you can use those selectors in your style sheets and not have an error. In order for these pseudos to actually do anything, we need to read and use these styles in Paint. That Paint support is currently limited to text decoration color, which allows you to change the colors of those squiggly lines, but other properties like color and background color aren't yet supported. For the highlight inheritance blink feature, we have a prototype working for the 4 built-in highlights, but a fair bit more work needs to be done, including extending it to the custom highlights, and we also need to optimize it for legacy content, because as far as we're aware, virtually all of the content that exists in the wild uses universal selection rules, because those are the only selectors that really worked intuitively. Custom highlights are being implemented under Highlight API, and this work is being driven by the Edge team at Microsoft, who's making some really good progress with that. Highlight painting is also improving, and this is something that I've probably spent almost half of my time on this year working on. But a lot of these improvements currently only benefit selection. Let's take a closer look at that. Going back to our example from earlier, here's what Blink did at the start of this year. We would start by painting the target text background color in a step just called background. Then we would paint the selection background color specifically, followed by the text that isn't highlighted by selection only, then the selected text, and finally a foreground step for everything else. So for target text, we would paint the highlighted text again, allowing you to change the color, whereas for spelling error and grammar error, we would paint only the squiggly lines. Since then, we have done some tinkering around the edges to sort of reorder some of these layers, but the deeper problem here is that selection is the only highlight pseudo that's implemented anywhere near correctly. All of the others are painted in sort of various very ad hoc ways. This is because we have one implementation just for selection and a completely separate implementation for all of the other highlights, including some markers that aren't exposed to CSS. There were various historical reasons for this split, but the current consensus seems to be that it'd be a good idea to join these together. So where do we go from here? For highlight inheritance, there's a whole bunch of work that still needs to be done, but the biggest ones are to make custom highlights use this new system, because currently custom highlights still inherit their styles from the originating element. Fernando from Microsoft has got a CL up for that. We want to iron out various edge cases that were explicitly handled under the old system, as well as invalidation and setting color to current color, which is kind of like a special case within a special case. We also want to improve performance of universal selection rules, which are incredibly prevalent. There are some potential compat risks and other issues that we need to look into. And ideally, we'd like to eventually expose these styles to dev tools. Let's say we've selected this text where we've got a span within a div. DevTools shows us the originating element styles on the div, and then when we go and inspect the span, we can see which styles we've inherited from the div. For highlights, this is not the case yet. When inspecting that span, we can see that the foreground color should be orange, but we have no idea why the background color should be green. We've been working on a design doc to deal with those separate implementations of selection and the other highlights. The basic idea is, well, at least for Paint, we want to try and roll selection into the marker system so that it becomes just another marker. This will allow us to port over the more subtle features that currently exist only for selection. Just for one example, on the right, we can see that selected text is actually painted twice, once for the parts that are inside the background rectangle, and once for the parts that are outside, in the case of italic text or complex scripts with ligatures. We're hoping to move forward with these proposals in the near future, so we'd really appreciate some help with things like internal representations and performance. Because we're the first engine to get this far in implementing the new spec, we've got a whole bunch of issues open around how highlights interact with other CSS features, like decorations, custom properties, compat behavior, and default colors. For some of these, we've proposed spec edits, but others need more discussion. We've also found some issues around testing highlights reliably. So these are things like being able to simulate spelling and grammar errors, or having browsers be able to do things like invert highlight colors in certain situations without breaking our ref tests. There's quite a long tail of work that needs to be done here. Some of the interesting ones include adding text decoration support to the other highlights, which might allow you to, say, strike through some text that has a spelling error, figuring out what to do with squiggly lines in spelling and grammar errors versus wavy and dotted decorations, which are currently implemented separately, and fixing our painting of text shadows on selection and I guess eventually all highlights. For that last one, you can see we've got some selected text here in gray, and the selection highlight has added its own shadow in blue, but it's currently clipped. Unfortunately, I found that it's not really possible to fix this bug just yet, because even if we had a way to move this clipping rectangle to the correct place for the text shadow offset, text shadows are currently offset in the wrong direction for vertical scripts, which just makes this a complete nightmare. So we need to rework how we paint text shadows before we can really look into this. Hopefully you enjoyed that tour of highlight pseudos and where we're at with them. If you want to know more, check out some of these links. I've got a blog post that I wrote back in May and another one coming soon if you're interested in some of the more technical details. And if you end up having any questions that I can't answer today, join us on the Chromium Slack at CSS Highlight Pseudos. Thanks for watching. Okay, yeah, so thanks for watching. I'll just pop that back up
check
on
out some
the
of these.
screen. So yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. It is 2 a.m. here, so it's going to be very best effort answers. Anyway, take it away. So Daniel has a question. What happens with anti-aliasing when text is rendered on top of text? So yeah, so what we have now with highlights like target text, where we paint the text again, is that with anti-aliasing, you have pixels that are not entirely opaque. They are translucent, and the you're going to have the first time you paint the text in one color, you're going to have translucent pixels in that color, or potentially other colors if you have like subpixel anti-aliasing. So if you then go and paint the text again in a different color, then you're going to, around the edges, you're sort of going to have like this thin line in some weird mixed color. Yeah. Do the shadows, Nicole has a question. Do the shadows from highlights end up on top of painted text painted previously? So I think from memory, the spec doesn't explicitly forbid that. It just says that we should try not to put shadows on top of other non-shadow text. But in our case specifically, at the moment, yes, shadows cover non-shadow text in earlier text runs. That's partly due to the draw looper thing that we use currently to paint them. Jeremy has a question. How does this interact with ligatures, or more generally, glyphs which may overlap the selection boundary? Yeah, so at the moment, what we have for selection is we've handled that quite carefully. If we've just got a glyph that exceeds the selection boundary, for selection we paint it twice, and what we do is we paint it in sort of unselected color first, clipping outside the rectangle. Then we clip inside the rectangle and paint it in the selection color. For ligatures, it's a bit more complex because we have to, so like, okay, in this example here, these two are actually two different letters, but they are a ligature glyph here. Currently, font technology doesn't actually allow us to rigorously figure out which parts of a ligature are which letters. So we kind of have to guess. So we guess that, you know, the first like a certain width of the glyph is for one letter. And that's how we actually decide how wide to make this rectangle here. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm not sure. I've forgotten how long we actually have.
I think you still have 10 minutes.
Alrighty. Thanks, Fred. Jeremy has a question. Do developers have a particular desire to support text shadow on spelling and grammar markers and so on? Or is this something included for completeness and or CSS working group request? That's a very good question. I'm not sure. And that's something that has come up while implementing because we found text shadow is really tricky to do correctly, and it's very buggy in Chromium right now. The question comes up, which is like, do we actually need this? I don't remember reading its reason for inclusion. I think from memory, the list of like applicable CSS properties that we like that the editors came up with when writing the spec was basically just based on like, let's come up with a set of properties that don't affect layout, because we don't want highlights to be able to do things like change the font size, which would be a performance nightmare. So, I mean, text shadows don't affect layout, so that's probably why they were included.
So one thing regarding text shadows is that, I mean, it's not totally clear why people need it or not in the different highlight pseudos. So maybe there could be the chance to, like, at some point decide that it's not supported in all of them. We added some use counters to explore how many people was using text shadow on selection highlight, and also how many people are just using it to do something else that is not text shadow none, because that's kind of the default if you don't want to see it now when you actually select a text, and that won't be needed with the new highlight inheritance. So depending on those use counters, maybe there could be changes on the spec regarding this. It's not totally clear yet and pending to be discussed probably.
Well, in my opinion, like, shadows should probably be treated similar to the way we only paint the glyphs once. So if you change the text shadow styling in one of the selection classes, we should try to skip those glyphs on the shadow of the base layer. And that way you could like change the color of the shadow for the selected letters or whatever other properties you wanted, and not end up with multiple shadows painted on top of each other.
Yeah, I can see some merits to that. I'm actually not sure, not actually sure myself which I feel is better. I mean, that's the way the spec is defined currently. That's not to say that that's how it has to be forever. Certainly since we're the first implementation to get this far.
Yeah, Jeremy's right that like technically with the spread, you still would get overlap at the edges, but there's like probably no way to customize shadows and avoid that unless we were to completely like customize the shadow painting in a way that it all paints into one layer with the different styles. But
yeah, I think the one thing that is certain throughout all of this is that we would have to do it. Like if we decided to change this, or even decide to say that like shadows shouldn't be allowed, and that it's not worth it to support them in highlight pseudos, it'd have to be coordinated, and we'd have to drop it from the spec, because like just having one implementation not support it is kind of problematic, because a lot of the time authors do things like set the text color to transparent and then just use the text shadow to make the text visible with like a glow but no foreground color. And if one implementation didn't support text shadows and highlights, then you could have text go invisible for some users. So we'd have to, yeah, we'd have to all decide to drop it, I think. Do other vendors support it? Yes. Wait, let me double check. Yes. So I don't know if I put a link in the chat, does that work? So Firefox supports shadows on selection, like independent text shadows on the selection pseudo. It supports it badly, but it is supported, because you can see like a yellow shadow and a blue shadow there. That's not really a dig at Firefox either, by the way. We also support it badly. Just everyone supports it badly at the moment. Yeah, thanks again for watching, everyone. We are almost out of time. But yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to find me afterwards on Slack or on Twitter or something. And yeah.